kind of limbo. You're neither here nor there.
Where are we?
Between light and shadow.
Greetings, bugs and ghouls, and welcome to Between Light and Shadow, the podcast that knocks on the Twilight Zone's door and asks for a trick and a treat. Hey kids, it's Craig, and autumn is upon us. And amid the crisp breeze and the crunch of leaves, we hear the shrieks and howls of All Hallows Eve, the one night out of the year when the Prince of Darkness rains blood-curdling terror down upon the heads of the innocent in the form of snot-nosed little brats in costumes banging on your door, making you get up off the couch over and over again to give them candy. And for what, exactly? For putting down their smartphones and actually going outside for a change? For putting on some half-assed costume instead of the usual half-assed shit they wear? Man, I used to dress up for free. And no, I don't mean I was a cross-dresser. I had a homemade Greatest American Hero costume that I used to bust out on occasion. Yeah, I know. It's a wonder I ever lost my virginity. So Halloween is right around the corner, kids. The devil's one night out of the year to roam free upon the earth. So what better time to check out his satanic majesty's visit to the Twilight Zone? There were a total of 4, but we're only focusing on the first 2. I guess that means next year's Halloween episode is already booked. If we're still on the air, that is. Escape Clause premiered on November 6th, 1959. It was the 6th episode to air, but only the 3rd episode produced. It was written by Rod Serling, and it was directed by Mitchell Leeson, who also directed the 16mm Shrine, which we looked at just last week. He also directed People Are Alike All Over. It's interesting. He only did 3 episodes, but they were all very different in tone. We have a moody noirish drama, a science fiction adventure, and a light supernatural comedy. Guess which one this is? The opening music cue should give you a clue. Meet the Bedekers, Walter and Ethel. Just your average city-dwelling American couple in the late 50s. Now, Walter is a germophobic hypochondriac who apparently exists solely to make his wife Ethel's life miserable. He's convinced that he is perpetually hovering near death's door, despite his physician's insistence that there's nothing whatsoever the matter with him. Now, he's paid a visit by a man named Cadwallader, who makes him a simple but enticing offer.
And this little item that you want in return, what do we call that?
Well, what could we call that? We could call it a little piece of your makeup, a crumb off the crust of your structure, a fragment of an atom of your being, or a...
Or what?
A soul?
You're the devil.
At your service. How about it, Mr. Bedeker? Why not? A partnership of a sort. You deed to me your so-called soul, and in exchange I give you immortality. And then indestructibility. Complete indestructibility. Nothing can hurt you.
Nothing can hurt me? And I live forever?
Certainly. Why not forever? Governments and institutions may disintegrate. People die. But Walter Bedecker goes on and on.
Yep, he's the devil, looking to buy Walter's soul. And he'll even throw in a bonus escape clause, which will allow Walter to relinquish his immortality at any time as he sees fit. Walter signs the contract and promptly tests his indestructibility against the radiator in his apartment. His hands sizzle against the hot metal, but his flesh is unburned. He then gets himself into several quote-unquote accidents in order to rack up settlement checks. He quickly grows bored with that and tries guzzling some household chemicals. Nothing. He then heads up to the roof of his building to jump off. His wife Ethel tries to intervene and accidentally takes the swan dive herself. But Walter doesn't mourn the loss. Instead, he comes up with his latest daredevil stunt. He'll get himself convicted of Ethel's murder, then face off against the electric chair. However, the attorney he hires is too good. He gets Walter off with life. Walter is in a cell in short order, despondent at the trap he's laid for himself. Cadwallader reappears, suggesting that maybe this is the appropriate time to exercise that escape clause. Walter nods his head and drops dead. Bada boom! Isn't it ironic? Don't you think? A little too ironic? And yeah, I really do think.
It's like rain on your wedding day. It's a free ride when you've already paid. It's the good advice that you just didn't take. And who would have thought it figures?
Escape Clause is the first Twilight Zone episode of many to play the ironic comeuppance card, aka Cosmic Justice, capital C, capital J. Now, I wrote the following when I was spotlighting a different episode in my blog, but it fits in here nicely. The Twilight Zone isn't an easy thing to define. Despite Rod Serling's opening narrations, it's not really a physical location that you can cross over into. It's more conceptual, more abstract. Sometimes it's a state of mind. Sometimes it's a strange situation or circumstance. Sometimes it's a supernatural event. Like ice cream or toothpaste or even vodka these days, it comes in many flavors. But if there's one prevalent manifestation of this nebulous entity, it's a device by which cosmic justice is dispensed, righting that which is wrong through unusual means. We see it time and time again throughout the series run. Innocent or luckless people are granted second chances, while the cruel and selfish are knocked for a loop befitting their misdeeds.
Why does a man have to die? I ask you a question, Ethel. Why does a man have to die? The world goes on for millions of years, and how long is a man's life? This much. A drop, a microscopic fragment. Why can't a man live 500 years or 1,000? Why does he have to die almost the moment he's born?
Walter's rumination on the brevity of human life seems, I don't know, a little deep. Deep for him, I mean. The only depth of character he exhibits is how deep up his own ass he is, so it's a little bit surprising that he could suddenly become so eloquent. Kind of like blue-collar Earl Holliman dropping Charles Dickens quotes in Where Is Everybody? It's a Serling thing. I guess you just have to roll with it. But you know, the more you analyze Walter, the less sense his character makes. Has he always been this way? So paralyzed by his own irrational fear of germs that he can't even stand to have a window open, much less go outside? He couldn't have been. I mean, this is 1959, which means Ethel is a housewife, so he must have a job, right? And she married the guy, so maybe he wasn't always like this. What set him off, I wonder? I love that look that Ethel gives the doctor while Walter bitches and moans. It's a wonderful, please get me the hell out of here look. Now, we've already ascertained that Walter's pretty much insufferable, and now we're getting a look at the woman who, thanks to the societal restrictions of the time, has no choice but to suffer him. Nowadays, she ditched his sorry ass a long time ago. Now, in Serling's original script, we learn that she married Walter out of pity because he told her he only had a week to live. I like the low-key manner in which Cadwallader enters the scene. He begins a conversation with Walter before we ever even see him. For a moment, it seems like maybe this second voice represents Walter's inner monologue. And when he does appear, there's no flash of lightning, no plume of smoke. It imparts a very subtle tinge of the unreal, which is really all a light comedy like this requires. The episode overall is very successful at maintaining tone. Even when things take a dark turn, it remains essentially a light comedy. Now, speaking of Cadwallader's entrance, notice how Walter's first impulse is to check the window to see how he got into his room. On, what, the 38th floor? Nah, don't look to see if the door is open or maybe even the closet door. Go straight for the least likely possibility. The Devil's appearances on the Twilight Zone are generally handled in a winking fashion, except for one, and we'll put a pin in that for a bit. And this one is no exception. Now, aside from the generally jovial tone of the episode, we get a great sight gag in the form of Cadwallader's rubber signature stamp. Yep, it's a trident. Smoking and everything. This modern devil still wields the traditional old-school hardware. It's just a more corporate version. Kinda like Shere Khan, the fearsome tiger from the Jungle Book, was reimagined as a cutthroat businessman on Tailspin. I bet you never thought you'd hear a Tailspin reference on a Twilight Zone podcast, did you? So Walter is intentionally getting himself into accidents in order to make money, but we only see the one incident in the subway, which admittedly is pretty well done. I don't know, I kind of feel like a montage of his various exploits might have been more entertaining. I mean, I get that it's a 25-minute show, so you've got to move it along, but there is a bit of a disconnect here. Walter hasn't told Ethel what's going on at this point. He merely says that he's been in 14 accidents. How is she not freaked out by now? It's only when she watches him drink his Drano Martini that she demands to know what's going on. How did he do this 14 different times, presumably ruining every suit he owns in the process, without it at least coming up in conversation? Has this all happened in one day? No, it couldn't have, because claims adjusters wouldn't be handing him settlement checks that fast. Okay, call it plot expedience. I mean, it's a light comedy, so I should probably just let this go. The rooftop set is pretty obviously artificial, but there's something about those fake buildings in the background and all of those aerial antennas around, plus that glass skylight. I don't know, it's just all really cool looking. The artifice of it adds to the theatricality of the murder scene, like a really subtle take on the German expressionistic sets in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I mean, that's a bit of a reach, but you get me, right? Anyway, we'll see this same set in two other Season 1 episodes, A Passage for Trumpet and The Big Tall Wish. Wouldn't it be cool to see Henry's rabbit hutch off in a corner someplace with no explanation? And only later in the season would it make sense for those paying attention? Can't help it, I really want every episode to somehow take place in the same universe. So anyway, yeah, we'll see this rooftop again. This is the only time someone falls off of it, though.
What's it doing? Ethel, get out of my way. Get out of my way.
Please,
out of my way.
Walter calls the police to report that he murdered Ethel. However, I'm pretty sure the police are already on their way, since all the neighbors on the lower floors heard her screaming as she fell past their windows, and he was clearly in no hurry to get back down to his apartment. That's a nice touch, though, that perspective shot looking down the light well with all the lights coming on. It's a bit fake, like the rooftop set, but it looks great. My favorite film of all time is Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, so of course this scene reminds me of the opening sequence of that film, in which a beat cop takes a similar dive trying to save Jimmy Stewart.
Give me your hand.
When Cadwallader appears in Walter's jail cell, he only partially materializes, allowing us to see through him as Walter drops dead. And that's a cool touch, but it's weird that we can see the shadow of the cell bars on his back. If he's an intangible phantom at that moment, the shadows shouldn't touch him, right? And as long as I'm bitching about the ending, I'm kind of bothered by Walter's decision to utilize that escape clause when faced with life imprisonment. He's immortal and indestructible. We've already seen him get run over by a subway train and emerge unharmed. So how is a jail cell an insurmountable obstacle? There are all kinds of ways he could get out of there. Hell, if nothing else, he could just bang his head against the concrete wall until he eventually broke through. I don't know, maybe it shows that he's really short-sighted and small-minded. Or maybe it's just more plot expediency. There's like 20 seconds left in the episode, so it's gotta be wrapped up like pronto. Serling's end narration for Escape Clause contains one of the most poignant lines in the entire series run.
There's a saying, every man is put on earth, condemned to die. Time and method of execution unknown.
Every man is put on earth condemned to die. Time and method of execution unknown. You know, every time Serling disappoints me with some half-baked, overwritten bullshit, which we all know he wrote his share of, I always come back to that quote. It reminds me of how brilliant and poetic he could be, and how much better the landscape of television is because of him. That quote was used to great effect by Arlen Schumer in Visions from the Twilight Zone, which is a beautiful coffee table book that's sadly been out of print for quite a while now. You can still find it secondhand, though, and it is absolutely worth tracking down. And Arlen's a really cool guy. He does these traveling multimedia presentations on various subjects, the Twilight Zone included, and they're just fascinating. There are a couple of them on YouTube. Go check them out. Just do a search for Arlen Schumer. That's ARLENSCHUMER. Not sure if he's related to Amy Schumer or not. Amy Schumer. Escape Clause has a stock score from the CBS Music Library, which means it wasn't deemed worthy of original music. Oh wait, maybe I should put that differently. It didn't need an original score because it's almost all dialogue. So we mostly get quick little jazz cues, which is appropriate for this kind of episode. Act 2 contains several short bits by Jerry Goldsmith that will show up again later in the episode The Fever. Those same bits would later be edited together to form a track called Jazz Theme 2 on the fourth Twilight Zone soundtrack album from Varese Sarabande in the 80s. It's interesting. Almost that entire record is jazz music, or at least quasi-jazz music, except for Fred Steiner's score from King 9 Will Not Return, which we discussed a few weeks ago, which is definitely not jazz, and which is just plain disturbing as fuck. I guess some jazz music can be scary, but honestly, that King 9 music is even scarier than late John Coltrane. You know, there's actually quite a bit of great jazz to be found on the Twilight Zone, and I do loves me some jazz. Maybe I should do a special episode about it sometime. Actor David Wayne is really good as Walter. He's pretty thoroughly a dick, but you don't quite hate him even when he backs poor Ethel off that ledge. There's this weird glee in his eyes that's sorta, I don't know, charming. Impish. Yeah, he's an impish dick. Have those two words ever been said together before? Did I just make history? Impish dick. It sounds like a punk band. The Impish Dicks. Anyway, it's thanks to his impishness that I didn't subject him to the dick test. You can find David Wayne in various TV shows and films of the period, but I know him best as the very Irish cabbie Gus O'Toole in one of my favorite films of all time, 1948's moody supernatural love story, Portrait of Jenny. He even sings in it.
Yonder, yonder was the home of my sweetheart. Yonder, yonder, 'twas so long ago. I remember my lover and the kiss of no other love. Yonder, yonder was so long ago, was so long ago.
I suppose I ought to be minding my own business, but you're carrying quite a load, Mac, all by yourself.
Gus, you don't understand, and...
Mac, supposing... Now, remember, I'm only supposing, but...
What, Gus?
Well, supposing she didn't ever come back.
She's got to. Can't be that
Yeah, but if something happened to her, don't you have to go on living, pal? Don't you?
The entire cast of Portrait of Jenny is top-notch. You've got Joseph Cotton, Ethel Barrymore, Jennifer Jones, Lillian Gish. Really, if you've never seen it, check it out. It's definitely got a Twilight Zone vibe. It's the story of star-crossed lovers from different time periods who inexplicably encounter one another every so often. It actually sounds kind of like a Jack Finney story, but it's not. It's available on DVD, but not Blu-ray, damn it. In fact, it's the only movie in my top 10 that hasn't been released on Blu-ray. I keep hoping the Criterion Collection will do it, but I'm starting to think it's never going to come out in high definition, which is a shame. The cinematography is really gorgeous. Anyway, back to Escape Clause. Cadwallader is played by Thomas Gomez, who we will see again in the Season 2 episode Dust. And Ethel Bedecker is played by Virginia Christie, who appeared in several notable films: Judgment at Nuremberg, High Noon, the film noir classic The Killers, both the original in 1946 and the remake in 1964. And she's in another of my top 10 favorite movies of all time, the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And hey, Monster Kids, take note, she was in 2 classic Universal horror films. She played an unnamed Lady of the Night in House of Horrors in 1946. Before that, she was Princess Ananka herself in The Mummy's Curse in 1944. But if we still remember her today for anything, it's as Mrs. Olson in 21 years worth of Folgers coffee commercials. Coffee.
I told you the PTA's coming tonight, George. I'm too busy for nonsense.
PTA, huh? Gonna serve your coffee?
You joke about my coffee again. You hear, Mrs. Olson, like a broken record.
Well, it's one committee member to another. Maybe you should try Folgers coffee.
Why Folgers?
They blend it special. Folgers uses mountain-grown coffee.
Mountain-grown?
Yeah, that's the richest kind. Bet your husband tastes the difference.
Mrs. Olson, I'll try Folgers on him tonight.
How about another cup, honey?
You seconds on my coffee?
Tastes kind of great tonight.
See? No trick to making coffee. All you need is a better coffee.
Folgers.
Try Folgers, the mountain-grown coffee. Mountain-grown for better flavor.
Gotta love that Swedish accent, even though it's fake. She was born in Iowa. Escape Clause is another episode that Rod Serling turned into a short story for a book called Stories from the Twilight Zone in 1960. There's nothing really different to report, except that in the story, we learn that Walter has had 5 jobs in the last year and has quit all of them. Now, all in all, Escape Clause isn't quite a top-tier classic, but it's fine on its own terms. There are a number of sharp lines in the script, and the performances are all pretty good. Outside of that character motivation issue I talked about a little bit ago, there's really nothing wrong with this. I'd probably put it on the same level as The Chaser, another first season episode that's also a light supernatural comedy, which is also pretty good in and of itself, but feels a bit thin compared to the relative weightiness of most of the first season. There's just so much substance to the early Twilight Zones. Moody, dramatic, important somehow. The first season was groundbreaking, and it feels groundbreaking. A light comedy, even a really good light comedy, doesn't have the same resonance. And speaking of resonance, we'll see a more serious treatment of the immortality theme, minus the devil, later in Season 1 in Long Live Walter Jameson, which was written by Charles Beaumont. And speaking of Charles Beaumont, he just happened to write the next episode in this audio Halloween candy bowl. Pretty awesome segue, yeah? You just don't get this kind of thoughtful construction in other podcasts. The Horned One returned in Season 2's The Howling Man, which Beaumont adapted from his own short story. In the director's chair was Douglas Hayes, one of the more innovative directors to work on the show. He did a total of 9, including essentials like Eye of the Beholder, The Invaders, The After Hours. The Howling Man isn't necessarily up on that level, but it does have a lot going for it. Now, it first aired on November 4th, 1960, less than a week after Halloween, which is a real shame, because it turns out it's the perfect Halloween episode, but we'll get to that. Incidentally, the episode right before it was A Thing About Machines on October 28th, 1960, so I guess that was technically the series' Halloween episode. Unfortunately, the only scary thing about that one is that it pretty much sucks. Incidentally, Eye of the Beholder aired the week after The Howling Man, which I now associate with Halloween because I dressed up as one of the pig-faced doctors like 5 or 6 years ago. Those of you who follow us on Facebook may have seen it when I posted the link from my blog. If not, check it out on Facebook and go look at it. My wife Teresa did a pretty freaking amazing job on the mask.
Damn right I did.
And I said thank you many, many times. So anyway, The Howling Man. We open on a shot of a stormy sky, then pan over to a tight shot of a man looking a bit high-strung. His name is David Ellington, and it feels like he's addressing us directly, but he's not, we find out at the end.
I know, it's an incredible story. I of all people know this, and you won't believe me, no, not at first. But I'm going to tell you the whole thing. Then you will believe, because you must. You must believe.
We then get into the meat of the episode, which is actually a flashback to 20 years earlier. David Ellington is doing the tourist on foot routine through Europe, but he's caught an unspecified illness/plot device that apparently causes profuse sweating and vertigo and occasional blackouts, which sounds like me after a few hours at the Hoppy Brewer here in Gresham, Oregon, but I digress. David wanders around deliriously and winds up on the doorstep of a stock footage shot of a castle in a Bavarian village. It's a hermitage for some vaguely religious dudes with big scraggly beards, which, by the way, seem to be all the rage here in Portland. Now, they don't allow visitors, the hermitage, not Portland, so they not so politely ask him to leave, at which point he conveniently passes out, so they have no choice but to take him in. Turns out they probably should have left him out in the rain to die, but hindsight being 20/20, etc., yada yada yada. David wakes up and hears someone, or something, howling. He wanders around and finds the source of all that racket. It's a scraggly man locked up in a cell. We'll call him, I don't know, the Howling Man. This Howling Man begs to be released, claiming the Brotherhood is holding him without authority. One of the pseudo-monks breaks up the party and asks David to see the leader of the gang, Brother Jerome. Now, Bro Giro, no relation to Al Giro, denies that anyone is imprisoned at the Hermitage and pretends he can't hear the howling. David threatens to bring the authorities to investigate, forcing Bro Giro's hand. That guy in the cell? Well, he's the goddamn devil! Bro Giro pursued him for many years before he finally caught him, negating his satanic powers with his Staff of Truth, patent pending. David pretends to believe him, but sneaks out of his room that night and goes back to the cell, which isn't locked. The only thing holding that door shut is a miniature version of the Staff of Truth, which is easily reachable from inside the cell. Why hasn't he just freed himself? There's no time, the Howling Man pleads. David removes the Staff of Truth, and the cell door ominously swings open. And then, shock of shocks, the Howling Man turns into the goddamn devil and escapes. Oh shit, exclaims the world.
I'm sorry for you, my son. All your life you will remember this night. And you'll know, Mr. Ellington, whom you have turned loose upon the world.
I didn't believe you. I saw him and didn't recognize him.
That is man's weakness and Satan's strength.
Back in the present, we learn that David has spent the ensuing 20 years trying to find and recapture the devil, which he's finally done. He's got him locked in a room, the door secured by a miniature Staff of Truth. He's got to go out and arrange his captive's transport back to Bro Giro, so he warns the housekeeper not to open that door under any circumstance. As soon as he leaves, the howling starts up, and then, shock of shocks, she promptly removes the Staff of Truth, and the cycle begins anew. Beaumont's teleplay isn't that different from his original story, with two pretty big exceptions. First and foremost, David never sees the Howling Man transform into the devil. He chases after him, but loses him in the night. And second, David doesn't recapture him. World War II breaks out now that the devil has been set free, which is totally his fault for being a non-believing putz. But years later, he gets a postcard from Bro Giro, which states, "Rest now, my son. We have him back with us again." Of the 4 Twilight Zone episodes featuring an in-the-flesh devil character, the Howling Man is the only one that attempts to do so in a more or less serious fashion. No winking going on here, at least none that I could detect. Now, I kinda consider the Howling Man to be the Twilight Zone version of a Universal classic horror film. Not because of the devil necessarily, though I'll bet our more religious listeners would say he's the ultimate monster. It's more about the setting and the atmosphere. It's a dark and stormy night in a castle in a German village. And while we never learn the name of the village, Bro Giro does mention that Schwarzwald is nearby. But hell, it may as well be Versaria. Candles are all a-flicker, and the shadows on the wall are long and ominous. We half expect Dr. Frankenstein to come walking around the corner at any moment, with Igor following close behind. The off-kilter Bro Giro perfectly evokes the borderline crazy scientists and doctors that populate those old films. They may see things through a distorted lens. They may even be crazy as fuck, but they also happen to be right. A bolt of lightning will, in fact, reanimate a corpse. And yes, you can use alchemy to shrink people down to Cupid doll proportions. And of course, a bite from a werewolf will turn you into a werewolf too. And that scroungy guy howling in that cell downstairs?
It is the devil himself.
Gotta love that crash of lightning, right on cue to punctuate the dialogue. Classic scary movie stuff. The performances in The Howling Man are good, but damn if there's not some grade A ham on display. Nothing like a nice slab of ham while you're chewing the scenery up one side and down the other. And I'm not just talking about John Carradine here. There's not a single subtle performance to be found anywhere. But it still works because of the heightened atmosphere. But yeah, this is one of the campier Twilight Zones, but it's presented so fucking seriously. Just like the old Universal horror films, which again, I'm a huge fan of. But a friend of mine is an even bigger fan. Derek M. Koch runs the Monster Kid radio podcast, which I was tickled and honored to record a promo for last year. Prepare for a spine-tingling, nerve-shattering podcast featuring all your favorite monsters. You won't believe your ears when you listen to Monster Kid Radio. Hear your host, Derek M. Koch, and his ever-rotating stable of guests discuss your favorite classic and sometimes not-so-classic monster movies. Subscribe to Monster Kid Radio through iTunes or Stitcher, or visit monsterkidradio.net before the next weekly episode of Monster Kid Radio. Go through the archives for interviews with Sarah Karloff, Victoria Price, and Joel Hodgson. Listen to discussions about movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon, Island of Terror, and King Kong. And don't forget convention coverage from Monster Bash and the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival. Classic monsters, modern talk, and the head of Rondo Hatton, only on Monster Kid Radio! Derek's Monster Kid Radio won a coveted Rondo Award in 2015, so in the deep, dark sea of podcasts, well, it's the real deal. He's the real deal. And I'm happy and honored to have Derek here with me today to talk about The Howling Man. Derek, welcome to Between Light and Shadow.
Hey, thanks for having me, and thanks for your kind words. I appreciate it, man. Thank you.
So The Howling Man, this is a season 2 episode, so by now the Twilight Zone had been on for a little while. I don't know if it was at the height of its popularity. It probably wasn't, because I think that came later after it was already off. But the reason I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this one, Derek, is because, well, A, I'm covering it for Halloween. But B, there are aspects of this episode that I get a really strong Universal horror vibe off of. First and foremost, the location, because we're in this monastery somewhere in Europe. It felt to me like a Frankenstein movie.
Sure. No, it definitely feels like, even though it's rooted in the real world, which is something that the Universal films or even the Hammer films never really tried to do. Mm-hmm. They may have mentioned in passing, we're in Europe, but in The Howling Man, I mean, it's anchored in reality. That said, it still has that pseudo-European nebulous gothic feel that the earlier Universal monster movies had, whether it's Frankenstein or Dracula. Mm-hmm. And I did respond to that quite a bit. Frankenstein's castle, sure, I could see an analog here or a comparison here. I would even go as far as saying I could see part of castle, the Dracula aesthetic here as well. It definitely feels more like a 30s Universal than, say, like the late 50s.
Yes, definitely.
But it has that vibe for sure.
Yeah. Obviously, our villain here is the devil. And the devil's, of course, been depicted many times, many different ways over the years in TV and film. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't show up in any Universal classics, does he? I was trying to think back.
Oh, man. There's talk of like devil worship in The Black Cat.
Right.
Oh, man. I can't think of anything in which the devil himself actually shows up.
Wasn't he one of Dr. Pretorius's miniature?
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
That's
yeah.
right.
The little figures that Pretorius has in Bride of Frankenstein. I'm sure there's somebody there dressed up. Yeah. No, I can see him in my mind's eye right now.
One of the iconic bits of this episode is the transformation scene where the Howling Man actually becomes the full-on, very literal devil.
Sure.
The way they shot this was he's walking behind a series of pillars, and they would cut at each pillar, so there was a makeup change at each pillar. So by the time you get to the end, he's the devil.
And if I remember right, isn't that a moving shot? Isn't the camera actually traveling as well?
Yeah, they did the same shot like 5-6 times, and each time they would redo it, he would be in a different stage of makeup. So when they cut it all together, he's transforming. And it's, I mean, they could do that now and it would be seamless. I mean, it's pretty obvious what they're doing. Maybe it wasn't as obvious, on a 9-inch TV in 1960. Now, I've been a Twilight Zone fan for a really long time, since I was in middle school. And I really, I know, believe it or not. And I actually didn't discover the Universal monsters till a little bit later. So I never made this connection, honestly, until probably I got the movies on DVD. That transformation scene is very, very similar to the transformation scene in Werewolf of London.
Yeah.
They do the same basic thing. Henry Hull's just walking behind a series of things, and each time they cut and his makeup has changed. I just wonder if you picked up on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Certainly. Yeah, you can't, when you start talking about Universals and you're looking at other things and maybe kind of trying to keep the Universal in mind, you can't see a transformation and not think, hey, werewolf.
Right.
No, Wolfman. Now, with the Wolfman, it was a lot of lap dissolves. That's not what you see here. This is, like you said, every time he goes past another pillar, he's more advanced in the makeup. Mm-hmm. It is more Werewolf of London than the Wolfman. But yeah, certainly. I saw that. Sure.
Yeah. So you're obviously a big Monster Kid.
Sure.
Like, that is your thing. You have done some stuff on Monster Kid Radio, and recently you did a Star Trek episode, where you did your top 3 favorite Star Trek aliens. There's almost no monsters in the Twilight Zone, which, I mean, it's not really a monster thing. It's more of, a lot of it's more psychological or just fantasy supernatural stuff. But it seems like in 5 years they would have had a few more monsters. It's kind of odd. I mean, they have some aliens.
Yeah, they have the alien stuff, but yeah, you're right. I mean, Outer Limits was more, and which is not. I mean, 100%. Different Beasts had more of that, but yeah, Twilight Zone was more of a get inside your head, kind of mess with you a little bit.
Yeah, but the Outer Limits, it's all monsters.
Right.
The Outer Limits is my other favorite TV show.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned it.
Hey, thanks.
I know
you have been listening. Oh,
yeah,
man,
see,
it's very gratifying. Any final thoughts on the Howling Man?
On the Howling Man, we have one of Universal's Dracula's himself. In this.
It's in my notes, and you know what's funny is I had just scrolled down.
Oh, okay.
It's my first note in my thing.
We got John Carradine.
John Carradine,
who I think doesn't get enough respect as Dracula for the Universal movies. It's a completely different Dracula. He's not Lugosi at all.
Right.
But I still dig him. I love his approach and that cockeyed top hat. I just love it.
Yeah, no, I think he's great. And I think, it's a thankless thing. I mean, you're following Bela Lugosi's not, just an icon. The word icon seems a little low key for him. I mean, he is Dracula. No matter how many Draculas we ever have, he will be Dracula.
For better or worse. Yeah,
he is
definitely.
the go-to Dracula. So to bring someone else into that, and we kind of already had Lon Chaney Jr. playing son of Dracula,
right?
Which is not really. It's not actually, but it's kind of.
Is he or isn't he? Yeah.
But yeah, I think John Carradine is great as Dracula. I mean, it's a different take on it, and I think that's the best way to go. I think if he was just mimicking Lugosi, I think that would have been a disaster.
It would have come across as a caricature, and that's not what you want for a character like that. I think it's unfortunate that in House of Frankenstein he doesn't get a lot of interaction with the other monsters per se, but whatever, we'll take what we can get. Plus, because of all the legal stuff that goes on with Bela Lugosi's estate and his son and all that, a lot of times when Universal is promoting Dracula in like merchandising, lunchboxes, whatever, they'll use the Carradine Dracula as opposed to the Lugosi Dracula because of, again, the legal stuff behind the scenes. And I could geek out on that for hours, so I won't. But so you'll see John Carradine a lot of times represented whenever there's a book that comes out doing a retrospective of the Universal monsters, or a lunchbox, or a notebook. Anytime you see this, you'll see Carradine represented probably more in the merchandise than you ever did in the films.
Right, which is probably confusing for some people.
Sure.
Because I think probably a lot more people have seen Dracula than have seen House of Dracula.
Mm-hmm. I really dug this episode. To kind of bring it back to Twilight Zone, I enjoyed this episode a lot. It's a fun, well, as fun as a spooky house movie can be, it's written by Charles Beaumont, whom I'm a big fan of.
Love Charles Beaumont.
Yeah, I mean, he was taken from us way too soon. He is responsible for so much quality storytelling on television and in films.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate he didn't have a chance to do more. But, I mean, it's a great little episode. The music is fantastic.
Yeah.
And even though it's not, a Hans Salter or anything like that, it still feels like a Universal monster movie with the music.
Yeah, it's kind of too bad that they didn't commission an original score for that. I mean, there are several Twilight Zones that have original scores. This one was library cues, but a lot of it is from earlier Twilight Zone episodes.
Well, they chose wisely, because the music, I thought, fit perfectly for what they were doing.
That is a whole episode in itself. They did an amazing job of choosing library cues that not only fit really well, and not just in this episode, I'm talking in general in the whole series, but that actually were from like previous episodes that kind of had a thematic similarity.
Okay.
Things that probably audiences would have never picked up on. But it's kind of amazing. And I do talk about that some here and there on the podcast, just how they picked these. The library cues were amazing. I mean, it's every bit as effective as an original score. But it would have been a kind of a neat thing if they had gotten somebody in there to do a more of an homage kind of a score.
Sure.
But this is a really atypical episode in general. I mean, there's no other Twilight Zone episode like this. And I'm assuming that the Universal flair is intentional.
Sure.
It'd be kind of hilarious if it was an accident and nobody really knew what they were doing, but I love it too. It's interesting. So Sci-Fi does these marathons, Sci-Fi Channel, and the most recent one they did, I think it was either the 4th of July or New Year's. They showed the entire series in order, which they'd never done before.
Wow.
But they kind of chop these things to hell, and apparently I don't watch them because I don't obviously need to.
Right.
I've got several.
Go back to our conversation about how many times we bought these things.
Yeah. I'm covered. But apparently for the Howling Man, they cut the transformation scene, which is bizarre. And to me, it almost seems like, well, how did that even play? How did that even make sense? Of course, most people watching, already know what's going on. They've seen it before, but I thought, of all places to cut, like they cut that. And there was some discussion, I think on a Facebook group, about how there was concern about the religious aspect, that maybe people would be offended.
Really?
And I thought, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, this has existed for like 56, 57 years now. It's like, if someone was going to be offended by it, this would have already happened.
Yeah. What kind of step backward was that?
Yeah. I mean, it was crazy. I just thought, who is in charge of programming? Who is doing that?
I love that transformation scene. I mean, I can't imagine cutting it. I went back and I listened to a reading of the original story this is based on before watching the episode again. And there really is no transformation scene in the story itself.
Right.
It just, there's one moment of dialogue and boom,
yeah,
it's done. Yeah. So to have it kind of drawn out and done the way that it was done for a visual medium, I loved it.
And I think it's important, if again, they were intentionally going for, like a classic horror vibe, you have to see it.
Sure.
And that was kind of an argument in production because Beaumont's teleplay doesn't have a transformation either.
Okay.
What it has is the protagonist is chasing him and he jumps over a wall and escapes. And all that's left is like an imprint of a cloven hoof.
Ooh.
Which is cool in and of itself. If this were a more subtle kind of a story, it's not subtle. There's very little subtlety going on here. But yeah, so it's interesting that only happened like during the production where it was decided, no, hey, we need to actually show this. And I think either would have worked, but there is a certain payoff that you get by actually seeing it. But yeah, no, I love the Howling Man. I think it's like I said, it's very atypical. There's no other Twilight Zone even remotely like it. So yeah, I love it. I think it's great. Well, Derek, I want to thank you for coming on. This was great. I really appreciate it. it seems like every time I have somebody on, it really kind of legitimizes this whole thing a little bit.
Oh, come on now. No, you know, I'm not going to call myself, you know, a veteran or whatever. I've been podcasting for years, and I've listened to a lot of different podcasts, not just in the genres that I love, but, you know, in some genres that people probably don't expect me to enjoy. I listen to a lot of wrestling podcasts, a lot of writing podcasts, a lot of science and history podcasts. So, I mean, I've listened to a lot of different types of podcasts, and I feel like yours is solid. Your production, your attention to detail when it comes to your production, your putting everything together, and the little bits that you throw in every once in a while, your wife's comments. I mean, those are fantastic. It gives the show personality. I'm loving what you're doing. And listeners, this is how you get on a show. You go on, and this is how you get invited back, because then you start, you know, blowing smoke up the. I'm sorry. No, in all seriousness, no, I really do enjoy what you're doing.
Well, thank you. That's really good to hear. Yeah, like I said, the feedback's been nice. But it's a lot of work. Not trying to make anybody feel bad, listeners. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to guilt you here. But this podcast, it's a lot. It takes and I suppose over time I'll probably refine, you know, the workflow and kind of get it down to something manageable. But right now, I mean, it's taking a lot of my time to do this, and it's really in the post-production aspect. It's putting it all together, and but I'm a little bit meticulous, and you know, it's my own fault, because I could probably throw it together and probably nobody would notice any difference.
Hey, you know what? I mean, your first listener is yourself, though, really, right. and you want to please yourself when it comes to. Welcome to the How to Do a Podcast. No, I mean, your first listener, your first. I mean, you're excuse me, you're your first, you know, critic. You're the person that you've got to please first. If you're not pleasing yourself, then what's the point? And wow, that could go somewhere else altogether. Speaking of the kinds of podcasts,
this just turned into something else entirely. So we're gonna cut Derek off.
Yeah, why don't we stop? I'm gonna go watch a monster movie.
Right? Yeah. Again, Derek, thanks a lot for popping in. We really appreciate it, and this has been fun.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's been an honor.
Happy Halloween.
Hey, you too, man.
The Howling Man is another stock-scored episode. It's mostly Bernard Herrmann cues from Where Is Everybody, but there's also a great Herrmann curiosity here too. The transformation scene that Derek and I talked about uses an alternate Twilight Zone main theme that was never actually used, and it's not the one from The Lonely that we heard a few weeks back either. This one was part of Herrmann's score for Eye of the Beholder, but was never used, which isn't surprising, because by then the more familiar Marius Constant theme was in place, and would be for the rest of the series. The show wasn't in need of a new theme song, so it was tossed into the deep, echoey cavern of the CBS Music Library, and then pulled out almost immediately for The Howling Man. However, since episodes weren't aired in the order they were produced, Eye of the Beholder premiered after The Howling Man, so the rejected piece of music was actually heard before the episode it was intended for aired. We also get a couple of very interesting library cues from Jerry Goldsmith. First up is Mysterious Storm, which appears at the very beginning of the episode when David arrives at the Hermitage. The Twilight Zone will get a lot more mileage out of that cue in Death's Head Revisited, in Season 3, where it will basically dominate the entire episode. It actually sounds very much like a cue called The Killing from Bernard Herrmann's rejected score from Torn Curtain, which I mentioned a couple of weeks back. Now, the Goldsmith cue predates Herrmann's by a few years, so I don't know, maybe old Benny did a little borrowing? But hey, the other Goldsmith cue used in The Howling Man is one called Secret Circle, which sounds practically identical to a cue from Herrmann's score for the classic radio play The Hitchhiker, which came way before it. So I guess that makes them even? You know, it's a bit creepy how these music connections keep popping up. Call it synchronicity, or fate, or just dumb luck. Considering the personality of this podcast so far, I'm inclined to call it dumb luck. Let's see, what else? Oh, this is another episode to be commemorated in plastic as an action figure. The Howling Man was one of Biff Bang Pow's very first 8-inch Twilight Zone action figures back in 2010. They didn't call him the Howling Man, though. Just Satan. I mean, I guess technically he is Satan, and the Howling Man is just his earthly disguise, but the Howling Man is so much more evocative as a name. Biff Bang Pow was apparently not too concerned about the potential controversy of not just making an action figure out of him at all, but calling him Satan. Not the Howling Man, not the devil, but Satan, which is just so direct and in your face. And of all the characters they could have done in their first wave, they apparently felt like the devil himself was a really important one to get out there. It makes me wonder who's really pulling the strings over at Biff Bang Pow.
Could it be
They never made a Brother Jerome figure, and they're not even making the 8-inch figures at all anymore, so there's an awesome diorama that'll never happen. But they're still making the smaller 3 3/4-inch figures. But so far, no Satan, no Brother Jerome. So everyone's got their favorite classic monster. I adore them all, but I definitely gravitate toward Frankenstein's monster. However, I've developed a really strong attraction to the creature from the Black Lagoon in recent years. Don't ask me to choose because I can't. I won't. However, I can choose between the two devils duking it out this week. For me, the Howling Man trumps Cadwallader. I mean, sure, the episode is melodramatic as hell, and the devil is a bit too on the nose in terms of makeup design, but the episode is gorgeous to look at, and that classic Universal horror vibe seals the deal for me. Like I said earlier, it's not necessarily top shelf Twilight Zone, but there's a lot there to love if you're a monster kid like me. Now, Escape Clause is clever and fun, so if you watch the episodes back to back, think of it as the opening act comedian warming you up for the spooky main attraction. Now, like I said earlier, Cadwallader and the Howling Man are only 2 of the Twilight Zone's run-ins with the devil. There are 4 total. Actually 5 if you count the Mystic Seer fortune-telling machine. But he's not the only colorful supernatural entity to make repeat visits to the 5th dimension. And next week, we'll be looking at a trilogy of tales revolving around somebody even scarier than the devil, though he's oftentimes misunderstood and usually turns out to be pretty benevolent. You need a hint? I mean, I don't want to spoil the surprise, but, well, okay, here you go. He's a scythe for sore eyes. Well, kids, I think that'll about do it for this spooky installment of the podcast. Now, if you dig us, proclaim it all across the land by liking us on Facebook and following us on Tumblr. Just do a search for @ZonePod, one word, ZONEPOD, and you can't miss us. Now, I suppose a review on iTunes would be cool too, but no pressure. And if you don't like us, it's cool. We're not for everybody. But if you don't like us, don't leave us a review on iTunes. But if you don't like us, why are you still listening? You can also hit us up privately at zonepod@gmail.com. That's still one word, ZONEPOD. So until next time, keep your pitchforks in your pants and play nice. And that goes double for you monster kids. Happy Halloween!
Between light and shadow.